My name's Tasha. I'm 27, been driving trucks for about 5 years now. It's a weird job, but I love it. The freedom, the open road, the fact that every day is different. Tonight, I was on a long haul through the Midwest, somewhere between Missouri and nowhere. My boyfriend Kyle was in the sleeper cab, knocked out cold. He's a good guy, likes to tag along with me sometimes, just to keep me company, though he's more of a day person. I told him to go rest, and he hadn't argued. The gas station was empty, just one other car parked by the side, engine off, and no sign of a driver. I remember thinking that was odd. The car looked abandoned, but there was a duffel bag in the passenger seat, like someone meant to come back for it. As I stepped out of the cab, I saw him, a clown, sitting on the curb, right by the entrance to the convenience store, just staring at the ground, holding a single red balloon. I wish I could say I was brave about it, that I shrugged it off and walked inside like nothing could faze me. But something about that clown made my skin crawl. He wasn't moving, just sitting there in a faded yellow suit, the kind kids used to wear at birthday parties in old pictures. All ruffles and oversized shoes. His face was painted, but the makeup was smudged, like he'd been wearing it for days. His eyes. God, his eyes were hollow, staring down like there was something fascinating about the asphalt beneath his feet. I told myself to keep moving, just focus on the task at hand, fuel up, grab a coffee, and get back on the road. As I started pumping the gas, I couldn't help glancing over at him. He hadn't moved, but I swear I felt his eyes shift. Not his head, just his eyes, following me in that way that sent a chill up my spine. I was half watching him when I noticed something. He was no longer alone. My heart jumped. He was tapping on the truck window, right where Kyle was sleeping. My instinct was to shout, but my voice caught in my throat, and I just stood there, frozen. He tapped again, a rhythmic knock, 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 but Kyle didn't stir. He's always been a heavy sleeper. Before I could react, the clown turned away from the window and looked at me, tilting his head just slightly as if to say, "What are you going to do?" I forced myself to move, yanked the gas nozzle out, my hands shaking as I fumbled to screw the cap back on. I jumped back into the cab and slammed the door, locking it immediately. Kyle barely stirred, mumbling something about the noise, but I didn't wait to explain. I shoved the key into the ignition and we were out of there. I glanced in the rearview mirror as we pulled away, but the clown was just standing there, his face still expressionless, the balloon drifting lazily above him. I thought that would be the end of it. Just a creepy story I'd tell Kyle when he woke up, laugh about how weird the world can be at 3 in the morning. But about 10 miles down the road, I saw it. A balloon, tied to a highway sign, bobbing in the wind. My heart sank. It was red, just like the clown's, and there was something written on the sign in big, messy letters. "Keep smiling, Tasha." Kyle was still asleep, and I didn't want to wake him, maybe out of fear of sounding crazy, or maybe because I just didn't want to hear myself say it out loud. I tried to shake it off, told myself it was just a coincidence. But I couldn't forget the way that clown had looked at me, like he knew me, like he'd been waiting. As the miles rolled by, I couldn't help but think about my dad. He'd been a trucker too back in the 80s, and I remember the stories he used to tell. Late-night tales of weird things on the highways, things that didn't make sense. One story stuck with me more than the others, about clowns, back when there was a string of disappearances along the interstate. Dad said the rumor was they'd hitch rides in the backs of trucks, hiding until they found the right moment to... Well, he never finished that part, just left it hanging, letting my imagination fill in the gaps. I kept glancing in the side mirrors, half expecting to see something there, something I couldn't explain. The road stretched on, empty and endless, the kind of darkness that swallows everything. Then I heard it, a soft thud from the back. I tried to convince myself it was just the load shifting, but it didn't feel right. I pulled over, my hands slick with sweat, heart pounding. I stepped out, the cold air hitting me like a slap to the face. I walked around to the back of the truck, every step feeling heavier than the last. I opened the latch and let the door swing open. There was nothing, at first. But then I saw it, A single red clown shoe, lying there, almost casually, like someone had just dropped it. I slammed the door shut and ran back to the cab, my heart in my throat. I locked the doors again, and this time I shook Kyle awake. He groaned, rubbed his eyes, and asked what was wrong, but I couldn't find the words to explain. I just kept driving, kept my eyes forward, trying to ignore the feeling that we weren't alone. A few days later, we were home, and I had almost convinced myself it was all in my head. Just a bad night and a string of coincidences. Then I saw it on the news. A gas station off Route 12. A murder. The anchor said something about a woman found behind the counter, and they showed a grainy security clip. My heart stopped. There, in the corner of the screen, was my truck, pulling away, and the clown, standing by the pump, watching us leave. My hands shook as I turned off the TV. Kyle asked me what was wrong, but I couldn't answer. All I could think about was the clown, the balloon, and the note I found later in the glove compartment, a scrap of paper smeared with red ink. You're fun to watch. It wasn't just a gas station, it wasn't just a clown, and I still don't know how he knew my name. Story 2. My name is Jake, and I'm 34. Life hasn't been easy lately. I'm recently divorced, living in a small apartment in Cincinnati, Ohio, and trying my best to stay involved in my daughter Sophie's life. Sophie's only 6, and she's the light of my life. The divorce hit her hard, harder than I'd ever wanted. So when her birthday came around, I knew I had to make it special. I wanted to make up for all the times I hadn't been there, to give her something to smile about. Funny thing is, I've always hated clowns. It goes way back to when I was a kid, maybe 7 or 8. I had a bizarre encounter at a carnival, one of those old-fashioned ones that roll into town once a year. I still remember the way the clown followed me into the funhouse, his bright painted smile seeming to grow wider in the flickering light. He whispered my name, and I remember running until I found my dad. Of course, now I brush it off as silly, just a kid's overactive imagination, but the memory lingers, always at the back of my mind. That's why, when I saw the clown standing outside my apartment at midnight, I thought maybe I was losing it. Clowns don't just stand on residential streets at midnight. The next day was Sophie's birthday party. We'd planned a small celebration at a local park, just a few of her friends, some games, and a hired clown to entertain the kids. But of course, things went wrong. The clown canceled last minute, leaving me scrambling for a replacement. I didn't want to let Sophie down, not after everything she'd been through. So, when a man in a clown costume showed up out of nowhere, offering to perform, I should have been more cautious. But he seemed friendly, enthusiastic even, and I was desperate. He called himself Mr. Giggles. I didn't remember booking him, and he wasn't the original clown I'd hired, but he had the costume, the makeup, and a whole bag of props. He started doing tricks for the kids. Balloon animals, juggling, even some magic. But there was something off about him. His tricks were unsettling, and not in a funny way. He made these odd comments, like telling one kid he could read their future, and the way he smiled didn't sit right with me. Sophie seemed happy enough, though, and that was what mattered. After the party, Sophie came up to me and said, "Daddy, Mr. Giggles whispered something weird in my ear." I tried not to show my concern. "What did he say, sweetheart?" She scrunched up her face, trying to remember. "He said he'd see me again soon. Isn't that silly, Daddy?" I forced a laugh and nodded. "Yeah, honey. Just silly clown talk." But deep down, I felt a prickle of unease. That night, after I dropped Sophie back at her mom's, I drove home, trying to shake off the weird feeling. When I reached my apartment, I noticed something tied to my car's antenna. A balloon animal. A twisted red dog. My stomach sank, and then I heard it. Soft laughter, drifting through the darkness. I spun around, my heart pounding, but the street was empty. Just shadows stretching under the streetlights. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the clown, about what Sophie had said. Memories of that carnival from my childhood started bubbling to the surface. I remembered the funhouse, the way the clown had followed me, the whisper of my name echoing in the narrow hall of mirrors. It was the same feeling now, that something was watching, waiting. The next day, an email appeared in my inbox. There was no sender, just an attachment, a photo. It was from Sophie's party. She was standing by the picnic table, smiling, her friends gathered around her. But something was wrong. I distinctly remembered Mr. Giggles standing next to her when I took that picture. He had been right there, his gloved hand resting on her shoulder. But in the photo, there was no clown, just an empty space where he should have been. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I went back to the park the next morning, asked to speak to the manager. I needed to know if Mr. Giggles had permission to be there, if he was a last-minute replacement from the entertainment company. The manager frowned at me, shaking his head. "No clowns were permitted yesterday," he said. "We don't allow performers without clearance." A chill ran through me. I took out my phone, pulled up the number I had called to book the replacement clown, but it was disconnected. Later that week, I went to visit my parents. I needed some comfort, something to ground me, to make me feel like I wasn't losing my mind. While I was there, I went up to the attic to look through some old boxes. I found a photo album from my childhood, and as I flipped through it, I froze. There, in a picture from my 8th birthday, was the same clown. Standing in the background, partially obscured but unmistakable. The bright red nose, the painted smile. He looked exactly the same, unchanged by the decades that had passed. My blood ran cold, and I felt the room sway around me. It wasn't possible. I closed the album, my hands trembling. I still don't understand what happened or who, or what Mr. Giggles was. But every time I hear laughter, soft and distant in the night, I wonder if he's still out there, watching, waiting to keep his promise to my little girl. Story 3. My name is Ella, and I'm 30 years old. I've been a teacher for almost 7 years now, but I also work part-time as a nanny in a small New England town. The town is quiet, the kind of place where people still wave to each other when passing by. I've been nannying for the Johnsons for a little over 2 years. Max, their 8-year-old son, is like a little brother to me. He's got this wild imagination, and he loves drawing and playing at the local playground. His favorite thing in the world is the swing set there. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early October. The air was crisp, the leaves were fiery shades of red and orange, and Max and I had just finished his homework. As a reward, I took him to the playground. It was empty, probably because most kids were still in school or busy with after-school activities. Max ran straight to the swings like he always did, and I settled down on a bench, pulling out my phone to check some emails from work. "Ella, look!" Max's voice was bright with excitement. I looked up, expecting to see him soaring high on the swings, but instead, he was pointing to the far side of the playground. I squinted, but all I saw were the empty swings swaying gently in the breeze. "What is it, buddy?" I asked. "The clown. He's by the swings," Max insisted, still pointing. I frowned. There was no one there, just the empty playground equipment and the trees beyond. "I think your imagination's running wild, Max," I said with a smile, trying to make light of it. Max was always seeing things that weren't really there. Dragons in the clouds, secret agents hiding behind bushes. It was part of what made him such a fun kid to be around. Max, though, wasn't laughing. He kept staring at the swings, his brow furrowed. I tried to distract him, pushing him on the swing until he was laughing again, his feet kicking up toward the sky. But there was a chill in the air that had nothing to do with the weather. Later, as we walked home, Max kept glancing behind us, his little hand gripping mine tighter than usual. "He's following us," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I glanced back over my shoulder, but the sidewalk was empty. The trees rustled in the breeze, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves under our feet. "Max, there's no one there," I said gently, squeezing his hand. But even as I said it, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It was silly, I knew that. But every time Max looked back, I found myself doing the same, my heart beating a little faster each time. That night, After I put Max to bed, I heard the doorbell ring. The Johnsons were out for dinner, so it was just me in the house. I went to the door, expecting a package or maybe one of the neighbors, but when I opened it, there was no one there. Just a small balloon animal sitting on the welcome mat. It was a dog, twisted from a bright red balloon. There was a note tied to it with a piece of string. "For my new friend Max," it read, the handwriting jagged and uneven like a child's. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I looked out into the night, but there was no one there. Just the empty street and the faint glow of the streetlights. I brought the balloon inside, setting it on the kitchen counter, and tried to tell myself it was just some prank. Maybe one of the neighborhood kids messing around. But when I checked on Max, he was fast asleep, his little face scrunched up like he was having a bad dream. The next day, Max started drawing pictures. He's always loved drawing, but these were different. Each one was of a clown. Always the same clown, with a faded yellow suit and red, glowing eyes. He drew it standing by the swings, hiding behind a tree, standing in our yard. Every picture made my stomach twist a little more. "Why do you keep drawing the clown, Max?" I asked him one afternoon. "Because he's real," Max said simply, as if that explained everything. "He wants to be friends." I tried to brush it off, but the drawings kept coming. And then one night I saw him. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes after dinner. Max was in the living room, watching TV. I glanced out the window, and there he was, standing in the backyard just beyond the porch light. The clown. His face was pale, the makeup smeared, and he was holding a balloon. My heart stopped. I dropped the plate I was holding, the sound of it shattering, making Max jump in the other room. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands trembling. I kept my eyes on the clown, but as soon as the operator picked up, he was gone. Vanished, like he'd never been there at all. The police came, but they didn't find anything. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. They told me it was probably just some kids playing a prank, but I could see the way they looked at me, like they thought I was imagining things. Weeks went by, and the clown seemed to disappear. Max stopped drawing him, and I started to sleep through the night again. I almost convinced myself it had all been in my head, until I found Max's backpack. He'd left it in the living room, and when I went to pick it up, I felt something inside. I unzipped it, and my heart sank. It was full of balloon animals, dogs, swords, flowers, all twisted from bright red balloons. At the bottom of the bag was one last balloon animal. It was shaped like a person, and it had long, curly hair, just like mine. I don't know who the clown was, or what he wanted, but I do know one thing. He wasn't just in Max's imagination, and he's still out there, somewhere.